Hello, my friends. Hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughn Manor. And it's Mythos Monday. Yes, Mythos Monday has made its horrific reappearance. Mythos Monday, which I used to do every Monday when I first started my channel. But now I just do it once in a while, where I will talk about something H.P. Lovecraft. And today, we're going to be talking about the complete fiction of H.P. Lovecraft. What's it like to read the complete fiction? Should you just read the complete fiction of H.P. Lovecraft if you're going to read H.P. Lovecraft? Well, let's talk about it. Usually, when you've never read H.P. Lovecraft before, this is the book that I usually recommend as a great starting point. This is The Call of Cthulhu and Other Weird Stories. This is the Penguin edition. This is the deluxe edition, but there's also a regular Black Spine Classics version of this. This has the corrected texts in it by S.T. Joshi, and S.T. Joshi does the introduction and edits the volume. So this is an excellent place to start because it has stories from the beginning, middle, and end of H.P. Lovecraft's career. So it'll give you an idea of the different types of things that he wrote and how his writing changed over time without having to read every single story that he wrote. So it's a good starting place. You get a good idea of what kind of writer H.P. Lovecraft was from this volume. But what if you have read H.P. Lovecraft before? Or what if you just want to read every darn thing that he wrote? And so you pick up an edition of the complete fiction and want to read it. So there are some interesting things about doing that. There are some disadvantages to that, and there are some advantages to that. So this is the Barnes & Noble edition of H.P. Lovecraft's complete fiction. So this has everything except his revisions and his ghostwriting. He ghost wrote some stories for some other writers, and he did some pretty heavy revisions on some other writers' stories, which ended up being stories that were mostly Lovecraft. This doesn't have any of that with two exceptions. There are a couple of exceptions in here. One of them being a story for Harry Houdini under the pyramids, which is a pretty darn good story. But otherwise, this has everything. And it's really interesting to read it this way, to read everything he wrote from beginning to end. This is the Barnes & Noble edition, which is an excellent edition with introductions to each of the stories by S.T. Joshi, the preeminent H.P. Lovecraft scholar. There are other editions out there that are really good. And usually, if it's a decent edition, and most of them are, it seems like, they will have the stories presented in the order of composition. They will go along as he wrote them, which is important because H.P. Lovecraft's style changed a lot, and that is one of the advantages to reading everything from beginning to the end of his career. Because H.P. Lovecraft changed as a writer. A lot of things changed with H.P. Lovecraft through the course of his career. Because, people change over time. And Lovecraft was a guy who actually changed quite a lot over time. And his opinions and his ideas changed over time. Not just about writing fiction, but everything. H.P. Lovecraft was a guy who started off life pretty well off. His family was well off. They had money. They lost it all over time. And so he went from being a guy who started life carefree to being somebody who had to deal with absolute poverty towards the end of his life. And this changed his opinions on things quite a bit. He also, when he was younger, was very conservative He was a very conservative guy. Had some pretty narrow opinions about a lot of things. Didn't always seem like he understood the real world all that well. That changed. Lovecraft was a guy that had to deal with living in the Depression, the Great Depression. This changed his ideas on a lot of things. So he went from being a person who was very conservative politically to being a lot more liberal and even socialist in some of his ideas and some of his theories about how society should work, the ideal society he had his own ideas about. And he had gone through a lot by the time he reached the end of his career. He died young. He was in his 40s when he died. But his opinions on a lot of things changed drastically. So he was not the same man who was writing his last stories. He was very different from the man who started his literary career. And the stories themselves changed quite a bit. When Lovecraft started, he was very heavily influenced by his god of fiction, his favorite writer of all time, and that was, of course, Edgar Allan Poe. This should be no surprise, considering the type of fiction that Lovecraft wrote and what he was interested in. He adored Edgar Allan Poe. You see a lot of that, particularly in his earlier stories. He also discovered and became quite enamored with a fantasy writer named Dunsany, Lord Dunsany, who we don't hear about enough nowadays. Very talented and influential fantasy writer, Lord Dunsany. H.P. Lovecraft loved Lord Dunsany's fiction. And you actually see a lot of that in here as well. So in the earlier stories, you see these influences very strongly. Although even with his earlier fiction, Lovecraft made everything his own. Later on, he started reading more widely different weird writers like Algernon Blackwood, Arthur Machen, and some others, and some of their ideas he incorporated into his own work, again, making them all distinctly Lovecraft. But the stories changed quite a bit, and you'll notice that. Certainly, his later stories were a lot better, and that's one thing that you will notice, is that his earlier stories, while a lot of them are good, some of them not so good, from about the time of the Call of Cthulhu on, he was pretty consistently good. Then, that's when he came out with his most original stories, and the stories that we think of when we think of H.P. Lovecraft, the Cthulhu Mythos, for example. What became the Cthulhu Mythos? He never knew them as the Cthulhu Mythos, and he certainly never named them as such. But the earlier stories are interesting. They tend to be a lot shorter. There's a variety of different types of stories. He wrote straight horror, supernatural horror, and some fantasy stories. And he had his dream cycle of stories that were heavily influenced by Lord Dunsany. Like I said, they all tended to be a lot shorter than some of his later work. And the style was quite a bit different. The style that we kind of make fun of Lovecraft for, the kind of overwrought, adjective-laden style, was more from the beginning of his career. He became the master of his style in that he was really good at using his particular style to create an effect of dread and horror. But this was a lot better later on in his writing. And definitely some things changed about the way he wrote, where some of his horrors and his earlier stories tended to be so ghastly that they were indescribable. Later on, he took great pains to describe everything. If you read At the Mountains of Madness or the Dunwich Horror, you'll notice that the horrors in these stories are vividly described. intricately described. He became very good at describing his horrific creatures. And the stories became a lot longer. And towards the middle and the end of his career, he started writing a lot more in a science fiction vein. His stories became straight up science fiction. He more or less abandoned supernatural fiction for science fiction. Suddenly there were scientific explanations, even if human beings didn't understand them, in the stories. The Dreams in the Witch House is an interesting story, for example, where he takes a bunch of supernatural fiction tropes and gives them scientific explanations, while at the same time keeping the horror. Horror was always the major thing in all of Lovecraft's work. You only lost some of that horror in some of the later stories, where it started to focus on some other things. And later on in his fiction, you'll notice that H.P. Lovecraft actually starts identifying with some of his monsters, which is an interesting thing. So his fiction changed dramatically. And you'll notice that specifically if you read everything. You'll also come across some oddities in here. He had some humorous stories in here. Most specifically was the one romantic comedy that he wrote, Sweet Emma. Well, let me find the story, because if I just say it, I'll say it wrong. See, now I won't be able to find it. Let me see here. Sweet Ermengarde was his romantic comedy, which was basically written to make fun of another writer that he hated, because he hated that type of story. Imagine that. And so he wrote this terrific spoof of that kind of story. He had a sense of humor, Lovecraft did, which you can see in stories like Reanimator. Herbert West Reanimator has a lot of humor in it, actually, particularly towards the latter half of that story, the later parts of that story. And you do find that in here. It pops up now and again. So it's an interesting journey reading all of this. And it's also interesting because all of his stories tended to be interconnected. And that's one of the good things about reading them in the order of composition. It's the best way to come across some of his reoccurring themes and characters and monsters, and certain individuals pop up and are mentioned that were mentioned in earlier stories. Everything is interconnected in Lovecraft, whether it's a dream story or a Cthulhu Mythos story. Somehow, they all exist in the same world of horror. And one thing you do get when you read everything is this large picture of a universe of ghastly horror. He created this entire universe of horror, which is fascinating and kind of unique. It is unique. At least it was, until, everybody started copying Lovecraft, which he would have been fine with, actually. So there are some good reasons to read everything if you're particularly interested in this author. You do have to go through some stories, like I said, that aren't so great. And most of those are in the beginning of his career. Which is why usually if you've never read Lovecraft before, I would point you in another direction. Because you might start reading this and go, this isn't what I expected. Eventually you get to that stuff. But that stuff is later. And this volume ends up with, let's see, we get The Shadow Out of Time, and The Haunter of the Dark is the last story that he wrote, which is the last story in this volume and an interesting way to close out a career, because he kind of harkens back to some of his earlier stories. The Haunter of the Dark was shorter and had more of a supernatural feel than some of the stories that preceded it. And it was an excellent story. It was a good way to finish a career, even though I'm sure he didn't know he was finishing his career when he wrote it. Like I said, he died young. So those are just some of my thoughts about reading the complete Lovecraft. It's a worthwhile endeavor if you're interested in horror or Lovecraft as a writer. You learn a lot about Lovecraft as a writer when you do that. And it's an interesting way to experience the stories. Certainly if you're a Lovecraft fan, it is something I would recommend doing eventually. Just reading everything in the order that he wrote it. I will shut up now. I've gone on long enough. I will catch you next time.